We have the benefit of this beautiful facility and this beautiful room at the beautiful facility, courtesy of the Crocido Hospitality Group, and to welcome us is the head of that group, Vinny Crocido.
Thanks, John. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. Good morning, and thank you for being here on this snowy morning. Thanks for coming out. I want to thank the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance for making this event happen and for being the great stewards they are of our local history. It's well appreciated, and we really appreciate the partnership. It's an honor also to host this special event today, and we also value the relationship we have with the Alliance and to support our local history. So thank you very much. Today we have author Marty Klotz here. He's here to speak today. He is the author of Robert Rogers, Ranger, The Rise and Fall of an American Icon. I hope you're all going to enjoy it as much as I know I'm going to, and I certainly look forward to reading his book. So enjoy it. Thank you again for being here, and I'll turn it back over to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinny. As Vinny alluded to, we do have books. I think everyone here knows that. The books will be for sale as soon as Marty Klotz finishes his presentation. You have an opportunity, questions and answers. Marty will be happy to sign the books that you purchased today. So I would just like to say, I know we want to hear what Marty has to say, but I'd just like to highlight, in case you didn't see the materials on the table outside the room, we have a number of programs coming up. The latest one we're just announcing today officially is 3 weeks from today at this site. We'll have Professor Siobhan Hart from Skidmore College presenting her findings of the archaeological dig she did at Lake George Battlefield Park last summer, and her forecast for the dig she's going to do this summer. So that's pretty exciting. But there's a whole slew of programs listed on that one handout. And I particularly want to call your attention to the members only thing. Of course, these programs are open to the public. We do have special members only programs, including the most popular that we've offered, sold out immediately on 4 different occasions last year, and that's the Floating History Tour. How many people took the Floating History Tour last year? Wasn't it terrific? We're doing 2 different ones, and that's the concept from Mark Silo and Peter Werdeman and other people associated with the Alliance. This year we're going to do one of the north part of Lake George, leaving from Silver Bay and doing the northern tour, if you will, history that happened on and around Lake George, as well as another one at the south, which will replicate last year's, where we leave from the floating classroom dock behind the old courthouse building and kind of survey around the south part of the lake, including Diamond Island, which was a fabulous stop that I know everyone enjoyed. So I'd encourage you to join. I encourage you to participate in our local history, whether it's as a member of the Alliance or just a supporter of the other great groups. I know we have one of those great groups with us today, and that is the Rogers Island Visitor Center. And we're especially pleased to have folks from the Visitor Center with us here today because they have a special kinship with Rogers, obviously. But enough from me. If you have questions of me or anyone associated with the Alliance, feel free to ask when we're done today. But I'd like to turn it over to one of our dynamic volunteers, Rob Sanasardo, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, John. It is a privilege and honor to introduce our honorary guest. He's a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, serving as a federal prosecutor, then in his private practice representing investment professionals in criminal and regulatory investigations of securities and trading. Robert Rogers Ranger is his first published work on American colonial history, a topic that has captivated generations of people, including everybody in this room. So it is my pleasure, on behalf of the Alliance, to introduce Marty Klotz on his presentation on Robert Rogers Rangers, the rise and fall of an American icon.
Thank you, Rob, and I thank all of you in the audience for coming. I'm happy to be here. What I'm going to do today, I have lots of things to outline to talk about as specific topics. I have no idea whether I'm going to get through it all or not. I can talk forever about Rogers, and I'll probably cut off at some point and let people ask questions and answer what you really want to know. But before I get started with the presentation, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm interested in Robert Rogers. I was born in 1950, which meant that I grew up at the height of the Walt Disney, Davy Crockett era in American popular culture. I grew up in the Midwest. I think of myself as a Midwesterner, not a Yale person. And I was just fascinated with all of those characters, one of whom was Robert Rogers. I had a coonskin hat and a Kentucky rifle, and my house was close to a woods, and I could go tromping around and pretending to be different people. And that's how I originally got interested in him. Over the years, as I was working professionally for something in a totally different area, I have always continued reading about American colonial history, and I picked up over time that Rogers was a much more complicated person than I had originally understood. He was portrayed when I was a kid as an unqualified military hero in the history of the armed forces. And then I came to learn that after the French and Indian War, he really had a significant decline. He had gambling problems, he had financial problems, he had drinking problems, he fought as a loyalist in the American Revolution. And that I thought was really peculiar because he was always portrayed as the classic American person, self-made, self-taught, and rejecting British hierarchy as hidebound and inappropriate. And how could this person wind up on the wrong side of the Revolutionary War? And then after the Revolutionary War, his final 15 years of his life were just straight downhill, and he died in London. Nobody in America found out when and where he died until like the middle of the 20th century. He was completely cut off from everybody in what is now the United States, and was obscure, impoverished, and basically tavern hopping for most of the final years of his life. And I thought, this is a really odd combination of character traits, and how do you explain it? So that's how I got interested in Rogers. This portrait of Rogers, by the way, which is the best known portrait of Rogers, is not Rogers. There is no portrait drawn from life of Robert Rogers. And this portrait, the history of it, is a London bookseller in 1775 thought it would be a great idea to do a series of drawings of colonial revolutionary leaders for the Revolutionary War, and was mistakenly of the view that Rogers was one of them. Rogers actually fought on the Crown side. And so he commissioned this portrait of Rogers, drawn by somebody who'd never met Rogers, had no idea what he looked like. Rogers, in the reading you can do about him, is described by everybody as an extremely physically robust person. One description calls him a giant. He was somebody who was a winner of all kinds of physical competitions. And to me, that doesn't look like this person at all. But whatever it is, this is not a portrait of Robert Rogers. So, I am going to talk first about Rogers' military career and the major battles that he is famous for. But all of his famous battles took place after he had already become famous. So before I get to the particular battles, I want to talk about how Rogers became famous. In 1755, he was arrested for counterfeiting in New Hampshire, which was then a very serious offense. And there are some colorful anecdotes about his counterfeiting career. But the long and the short of it is the authorities had him dead to rights. And he was set to go to trial and almost certainly get convicted of counterfeiting charges, which would have been a career ending right then and there, and nobody ever would have heard of him. But the French and Indian War came along, and both New Hampshire and Massachusetts were raising colonial forces to fight on different fronts. And Rogers, who had been released on bail from the counterfeiting charge, had the great idea that if he could recruit enough people to join one or both of the Massachusetts and New Hampshire forces, that would entitle him to be named an officer, he'd get shipped off someplace, and the whole counterfeiting thing would go away. And he was right, and that's what he ultimately did. He raised a company of 50 men from New Hampshire that joined a 500-person regiment that marched off to Albany and then Fort Edward, and Rogers was part of it. He missed the Battle of Lake George in 1755, where Sir William Johnson was the military leader for the colonial forces. Rogers was still either in Albany or Fort Edward at that point. But in that battle, where Johnson prevailed and the French retreated, Johnson's Mohawk friends that he had recruited as allies to the colonial and British forces suffered the greatest losses in the Battle of Lake George. And they went back to their villages to mourn all of their losses. And they had been the eyes and ears of Johnson's army. They were the best scouts, they knew the territory. And here is Johnson now stuck at Lake George. He's got marching orders from the British authorities that he's supposed to capture Crown Point. He's got an army of disgruntled colonials whose enlistment periods are about to expire. He's got supply problems. Everybody in the colonial forces is just terrified of the Indians, because this is Indian territory and they don't know anything about it. And Johnson has no scouts. He has no idea how many troops the French have, where they are, what their plans are, and he can't make decisions without getting more information. So Rogers' commanding officer apparently recommended Rogers as somebody who could do scouting for Sir William Johnson. And his very first scout, he went off. Johnson wanted to know how many troops do the French have at Crown Point. And by the way, since the bosses in Albany are telling me I've got to attack Crown Point, can you figure out for me, is there any way I can get artillery up there? What are the supply problems if we attack Crown Point, etc.? Rogers, in a nighttime scout with 2 other men, crawled up to the actual walls of Crown Point, French occupied, then climbed up a mountain overlooking Crown Point, and at daybreak sketched a complete map of the fort, counted up all the troops that were there, and came back to Johnson with a just breathtakingly detailed report about what he'd seen. A week or so later, he did the same thing in Ticonderoga, and he was then off for the fall of 1755 doing regular scouts to hunt out information about the enemy. And his information turned out to be incredibly accurate, and he also turned out to be the only person who was willing to do this extremely dangerous scouting. So Johnson's bosses in Albany kept saying, well, Rogers says the French have an awful lot of troops and it's not possible to bring artillery to Crown Point, and you're just sitting there on your hands, Sir William Johnson. He wasn't Sir yet. Get some other scouts to corroborate what Rogers is telling you. And Johnson said, Rogers is the only person who'll go. If I were at other people to go scout, they either won't do it at all, or they'll go out for a couple of miles and turn back at the first excuse with no information of any value. Rogers is the only person I can rely on. He's the only active person in this army, which is plagued by low morale. And so Rogers got the job and became Johnson's eyes and ears at the end of 1755. And he was involved in a whole host of small episodes, not only scouting and getting information that he could see with his own eyes, but taking prisoners who could be interrogated and getting involved in small ambushes where he'd kill a couple Indians or a couple of French. And by the end of 1755, he had completely won Johnson over, and Johnson recommended to Governor Shirley of Massachusetts, who was the highest ranking British officer in the colonies, that he be commissioned to form the Rangers because he was so good at it. And Shirley did that, and by 1756, Rogers was in command specifically of a body of troops called the Rangers, and throughout 1756 continued to be involved in small raids, the most impressive of which, I can't remember the month in 1756, but he and a troop of men manhandled 5 whaleboats over the mountain that separates Lake George from Lake Ticonderoga. It was a... Pardon? Champlain, sorry. This was a path that was about 8 or 10 miles. It took them 3 days to do it, but they get the boats in Lake Champlain, and they went on a raid in Lake Champlain, and the French thought they completely controlled Lake Champlain and had no idea where these boats came from. And Rogers attacked a couple of French supply ships, sank them, destroyed the supplies, captured, 4 or 5 people, killed a couple of others. That was his most famous exploit. So by the end of 1756, he was already known in the colonial press. One of the newspapers in Massachusetts referred to him as the famous Captain Rogers, which will figure in the first major battle that I'm going to talk about. He was extremely popular in the colonial press generally, mostly because Braddock had been defeated in the summer of 1755. The war was going terribly for the British and the colonies, and the only person who seemed to be doing anything was Robert Rogers. So by the end of 1756, he had a dozen or more small raids. He killed and captured a dozen or more French troops or French partisan supporting forces. He hadn't lost a single one of his own men in combat, which was a pretty remarkable feat, and he had just a very impressive record. He hadn't fought any major battles. He hadn't commanded any significant number of troops, but it was a great record. And that was where he stood when he came to the major battles that he's known for. Well, let me go back to this. So the major battles are, in the back, I'm sure you can't see this, but all of you probably know the geography of what we're talking about. On this map, Albany is down here. 2 of the battles that I'm going to be talking about took place in this area here between Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. And then his 3rd major battle was the raid on St. Francis, which is up here. So I call in my book the first battle the ambush. It was in January of 1757. It actually happened to have been fought primarily on snowshoes. So some people talk about 2 battles of snowshoes that Rogers was involved in. I used the battle on snowshoes for the next battle. In 1757, Rogers is sent out on a mission with, he started with 84 men, he sent 10 of them back. It was weather like this, bitterly cold, and a number of his troops got frostbite, so he wound up with a total force of 74 men. And the mission was to go out and capture some captives that could be interrogated so they could get current information about French troop numbers at Ticonderoga and Crown Point and French intentions if they could figure that out. So Rogers gets up to the southern portion of Lake Champlain, sort of halfway between Fort Ticonderoga, Fort Carillon, not Ticonderoga yet, but what I think of as Ticonderoga, halfway between there and Crown Point. And his men see 3 sleighs coming from Ticonderoga on their way to Crown Point. And Rogers commissions John Stark, his primary lieutenant, to take a portion of the men and get in front of the sleighs and capture them. And Rogers, with the rest of the men, will come in behind the sleighs and cut off their retreat. So they'll capture these 6 sleighs, or 3 sleighs and supplies and all the troops. Rogers starts taking his men to take up positions behind the 3 sleighs, and he sees, to his dismay, oh no, there are another 8 or 10 sleighs coming along, and if Stark seizes the 3 sleighs, it's gonna tip off the French. But he doesn't have time to get to Stark. So Stark captures the 3 sleighs, the 8 or 10 other sleighs following behind, run back to Ticonderoga, Carillon, and Rogers and his troops interrogate the captives they've taken from the sleighs. And they find out that Ticonderoga, Carillon, has just received one force of about 200 reinforcements, Indians and Canadian partisans, and another force of 150 expected later that day. They're a troop of 75, and they're thinking to themselves, now we're in for it because we have a large force, much larger than our own, that knows we're here and our line of retreat is cut off. Rogers says to the men, it's also at that point raining, and that's bad news for flintlock rifles with powder cans. Rogers says, let's go back to where we camped last night and build fires and dry our guns, so at least our guns will work. And the men do that, and they finish drying their guns, and they start heading back toward Lake George along the line that they used for their advance. And they don't get more than half a mile when the French have set up an ambush, because the French have found the line that they followed coming in, and they think to themselves, these guys are gonna, excuse me, in case you need it. Oh, thank you. They figure these guys are gonna come back the same way. So the French have set up an ambush, and the first volley kills the lead person. Rogers gets hit in the head, not fatally, but it's a very bloody wound. They quickly overrun the first Rangers, and the rest of them retreat. John Stark has set up a line of defense on a ridge at the rear, and they all sort of congregate there and manage to fend off the French. But they're outnumbered, and it looks like they're going to be completely overwhelmed. But this happened close to dark, and so when darkness falls, they pulled off a brilliant retreat circling around the French lines and behind them, and managed to get off to Lake George and ultimately escape. But they have very serious losses, 20 of the 74 men killed or captured by the French and Indians, including a couple of very valuable officers, and Rogers has gotten a second wound, and there are many others wounded, and Stark gets sent off on an overnight trip to what by this time is Fort William Henry to get reinforcements to come to the north end of Lake George and rescue them. And Stark, who's been fighting all day, then walks all night back to Fort William Henry and comes back with the relief force, and they're all taken care of. Rogers reports this as an unfortunate incident, but not that bad, and reports in his initial report, we were hopelessly outnumbered, we had no chance. There were 250 of the French components. We killed 30 or 40 of them, he says, in his original reports. By the time he gets around to doing a description of this battle in his journals, which he prepared in 1765, he claims that they killed 115 French, and continues to say what their numbers were. But he omits a lot of really important things about the battle, the most important of which is when they realize that the French know they're there, they hold a council of officers, and all of the officers except Rogers say, we gotta do something to stay out of the way of the French. They're gonna think we're coming back the way we left. Let's instead cross Lake Champlain out of sight of the French and filter back to Lake George down the east side of Lake Champlain and Lake George. They'll never know where we are and we'll all get back safely. If we go back the way we came, they're gonna set up an ambush. That's where they're looking for us. And Rogers says, no, I don't like that plan. And anyway, these people are too scared to attack the famous Captain Rogers. We'll be fine. And of course, he fell into exactly the ambush that his officers were concerned about, a couple of whom were killed in the fight. If they had done that, it in fact is completely clear that they would have escaped unharmed, because the French indeed moved their forces west from Fort Carillon, Ticonderoga, and Rogers and his troops would have been to the east and headed south about 15 or 20 miles away, and they would have been completely fine. So the entire loss of life of Rangers was because of what was really a poor strategic decision on Rogers' part that got them into trouble in the first place. Rogers also, in his account of the battle, makes it sound as if he's completely in charge. The John Stark family history is that Stark was the hero of the battle, that Rogers was actually incapacitated by his second wound and actually wanted to tell the people before dark, it's every man for himself now, which is what Rogers did at the end of the Battle of Snowshoes. And Stark said, no, we're all gonna get killed if we do that. Everybody stay in place, I'll shoot the first man who leaves the firing line, and he takes over control. And he is the person who leads this sneaky, evasive retreat around the French lines after dark has fallen. And he, of course, is the person who goes all the way to Fort William Henry to get help. But none of that comes out in Rogers' telling of the story. Okay, so this is the second battle on snowshoes, which I call the Battle on Snowshoes, and this is, I think, the one that everybody associates that name with. Rogers is sent out a year later, it's in March of 1758, on another scout in force, this time with a troop of 184 men, so he's counting himself, he's got 185. Their plan is to ambush a scouting party or a supply party and take captives, and they're up in this same area to the west of the north end of Lake George and the southern end of Lake Champlain. On the third or fourth day of their scout, their advanced scouts tell Rogers, there's an enemy, an Indian force approaching, let's set up an ambush. And the Rangers ambush the Indians. It's actually, the report is there's 90 or more of them, but it seems to be inaccurate, but who knows. They set up an ambush, they kill a few Indians, the Indians flee wildly, and all of the Rangers go rushing after them, hoping to kill more, get scalps. There were bounties for scalps paid throughout the war. So the Rangers collected a lot of money turning in scalps. Half of Rogers' troop is racing after the Indians with no officer in control of what they're doing. Rogers is back at the site of the original ambush, and and at least one of his biographers says what he's doing is scalping a couple of the Indians killed in the first fire of the ambush so that he can get the reward money. And it turns out, oh boy, these Indians were just the advanced scouting party of a larger French force. And the racing Rangers run right into them, and literally within a matter of about 2 minutes, 50 Rangers are killed, captured, or cut off, and have nowhere to go. So at this point, Rogers really is seriously outnumbered. The French force, although Rogers later claims that it's 700, was really 250. Rogers' force of 185 is smaller, but still, if a cohesive force arguably could have held together, and they were at least on the right side, they didn't have anybody behind them, they had a route of retreat back down to Fort William Henry. But with this very quick elimination of 50 of the Rangers, they're in a really difficult spot. And this time, unlike the battle of a year earlier, they are not able to hold their own against the French. And the battle starts earlier in the day, so they cannot hold out until dark to make their retreat. And this time, Rogers orders an every man for himself retreat, and they all take off. The agreed upon meeting point is a point on Lake George where they had cached supplies and canoes and things like that, so everybody knows where to go. But the retreat is a complete disaster because it's still daylight and they're outnumbered and they're all, it's every man for himself. And Rogers totally disappears during the middle of the retreat. This is the retreat from which the legend is he escaped the Indians by jumping off Rogers Rock or sliding down Rogers Rock, or maybe he walked up to the top of Rogers Rock and then reversed his snowshoes so that the Indians saw 2 tracks coming up and none leaving, and various different stories. None of these coming from Rogers, by the way, who never said a thing about what he was doing. But it is known that he was the last person to show up, or one of the last people at the meeting point. And at that point, the troop had been completely decimated. Of the 185 people, 130 were killed or captured, which is a casualty rate of 70% plus. And it was just a devastating loss for the French, for the Rangers. Rogers, when he ultimately reports about this, says that it was just impossible. The enemy force was 700. It was really 250. He claims that of the French and Indians that he was facing, he killed 150 and wounded another 150. The actual numbers are something like 8 to 10. And this was a major defeat, which, like the previous battle, arguably came about because of poor leadership on Rogers' part. He had men, running without control in enemy territory, running into forces that weren't expected, and that's what caused the disaster. Now, it's easy as, sitting in a room like this to say that was a command mistake, and it's harder to avoid mistakes like that when you're actually out on the battlefield. But it was a mistake, and it did lead to catastrophic consequences. Then the third major battle that Rogers fought was the one that everybody knows the most about, and this was the St. Francis raid. St. Francis is way up almost to the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. The St. Francis River flows into the St. Lawrence River. St. Francis was the town of Abenaki Indians that had always been a scourge to the northern frontier, New Hampshire in particular. And Rogers had been itching for an opportunity to attack St. Francis. And Amherst, for complicated reasons, gave him that opportunity in 1759 after the British had captured both Ticonderoga and Crown Point and were now in control of Lake George in its entirety and the lower portion of Lake Champlain. He is sent on the St. Francis raid was Rogers' brainchild. He thought he could strike the village behind enemy lines and get away unscathed. And the operation turned out to be just much more complicated and perilous than anybody could have appreciated. To get to St. Francis, it took 3 full weeks because the Rangers had to row down Lake Champlain because the French controlled the lake. When they got to the northeast corner of Lake Champlain, they had to cross just an enormous bog that took them days and days and days wading through knee-high water the entire time. When they got to the St. Francis River, it was too deep to ford, so it took them half a day to find a place where they could barely get across by doing a human chain, and that's what they did to get into position to attack St. Francis. Their original plan had been, after the attack, they would retreat to the boats that they'd hidden on the northeastern shore of Lake Champlain and get back by boat, traveling at night, and they left enough supplies that would cover them for the 10-day return trip. But they knew that they were then in enemy territory, so they left 2 Indians, 2 Mohawk Indians who were allied with the British and the colonials, to keep an eye on the boats from a distance and alert Rogers if the French discovered them. The French discovered them within about 24 hours. So before Rogers gets very far on his way to St. Francis, the Indians come and tell him bad news. The French have captured the boats, sunk them, destroyed the supplies. There's no retreat, and they know we're here, so there's no retreat back the way we came. The only way that Rogers sees out is to retreat to Fort Number 4, which is east of Ticonderoga and southeast of of St. Francis, but it's like a 200-mile trip over territory that none of the men know very much about. But Rogers decides we don't really have any choice. It's a long way from where we are to Fort Number 4 to begin with. At least if we attack St. Francis, we can take supplies from them and use that to get back. So Rogers and his men attack St. Francis at dawn, and in his report, Rogers contends that the Indians had all been up the night before getting drunk, and so they were all sleeping it off the next morning. It was a complete surprise when the Rangers attacked, and they killed at least 200 Indians in St. Francis and captured 20 women and children. Rogers had been under written orders from Amherst, whatever you do, I don't want any women or children killed or hurt. So he reports back to Amherst, followed your orders, killed 200 warriors, but took prisoners of the women and children that we found. So why is this an improbable claim that he killed 200 Abenaki warriors? First, the entire fighting force of the Abenakis was about 120. So if every single Abenaki had been in the village and every single one of them had been slain, it still wouldn't be close to 200 that he killed. Second, the lopsided numbers are totally improbable, even if you assume that the Rangers surprised them completely. Because with single-shot weapons, it's just very difficult to kill that many people while suffering virtually no casualties of your own. Let me get further on in my notes. Third, this is the middle of the campaign season, so it's perfectly to be expected that the warriors would be away from the village and the village would be undefended, which in fact is where they were. They were with the French at Ile-Noix, Nut Island, and at another Indian village closer to the French lines. And finally, if there were 200 warriors in the village and all of them got killed, how did there turn out to be only 20 women and children in the village to be captured? If you go through all of the arguments, and my book does this, I think you conclude without any hesitation that Rogers simply made up the story of killing 200 Indians at St. Francis. And that in fact, he killed, according to French reports, he killed 30 people, 20 of whom were women and children, and 10 of whom were non-combatant men. And if he killed any warriors at all, there were only 1 or 2 of them, and it was both basically the destruction of an undefended Indian village and the killing of a lot of non-combatants. And no surprise, that's the way the St. Francis Indians view it to this day. Why did Rogers do that? By the time he wrote the report, it was obvious that the retreat from St. Francis was an utter fiasco, and I will get into the details of the retreat in a minute. But Rogers knew that his own casualties were going to be absolutely horrendous, and he believed that he was going to come under great criticism from his military superiors for this harebrained raid that all went awry in predictable ways. And the way to fend that off was to report that he killed 200 Abenaki warriors, which essentially, had it been true, would have completely destroyed the fighting force of the Indians. On the retreat, Rogers, who had no casualties in the capture of St. Francis, lost 50 men killed or captured by the French and Indians, half of them to starvation or other factors that made the retreat difficult. The starvation came about because although the St. Francis Indians in fact had set aside substantial stores of food, and Rogers' orders were, everybody fill your knapsack with food. We got a 10-day trip to get to Fort number 4 if we're lucky. In fact, most of the Rangers filled their knapsacks with loot. St. Francis was, it's actually interesting, it was quite, for the time, quite a modern looking and quite prosperous town, and had an enormous amount of wealth. It had a Catholic church, they were Catholic converts. The church had things like silver icons and silver statues, and there was a lot of wealth in the town, and the Rangers basically stuffed their knapsacks with loot and not food, and the food ran out very quickly. By the time Rogers eventually split the group up into 8 or 10 smaller groups, thinking that foraging would be easier. But once he split them up, the French and Indians caught up with them, and a couple of the groups were completely destroyed. And of the remaining groups, 4 of them, including the one led by Rogers, engaged in clearly documented instances of cannibalism. It was just a horrible, horrible retreat. And Rogers knew perfectly well that eventually this report would come out and he would look very bad. And it was right after he reached Fort number 4 that he penned his report to Amherst, touting the 200 Indians killed, not saying anything about non-combatants killed, not letting on fully just what a disaster the retreat had been. And surprise, surprise, a copy of his report to Amherst reached the New England press simultaneously. So while Amherst and the British High Command are trying to digest exactly what happened at St. Francis, the papers are all over. This is the biggest victory of the war. This is just absolutely fabulous. What can we do to properly reward this enterprising commander? And that was essentially the story that everybody got in the public for decades and decades and decades. The information about cannibalism was suppressed consistently and only started trickling out, 10, 15, 20 years later. And the reports of casualties only got really confirmed, the story of what actually happened only got really confirmed in the 20th century. What was the problem with the St. Francis raid from a military point of view? The problem was Rogers had no exit plan. He was up literally 200 miles beyond enemy lines, but with a force of people on foot. So no matter what happened, they were going to have a 3-week retreat through enemy territory the entire way, and the likelihood that this would go wrong was just enormously high. Even if the French had not discovered and destroyed their boats and supplies on the line of retreat they wanted to use, the attack itself would have alerted everybody on the French side to their presence, and the French had more than adequate forces to cut them off if they had tried to retreat directly to Lake Champlain. So the only alternative was to retreat to Fort Number 4, where they didn't have the supplies to carry it out. Do I have another St. Francis slide? No, but this map shows you, this is St. Francis up here. The furthest the British lines reached were here, and that distance is about 150, 200 miles that they were behind enemy lines the entire time. So, there, I thought I had that. Rogers makes the report to Amherst that I told you about. Terrific victory at St. Francis. The press immediately gets the upbeat report, and it gets broadcast all over the colonies. The press touts this as a stunning victory, but the evidence of what horrible retreat it was, losing 50 men out of the attacking force, doesn't come out until it leaks out. The French complain immediately to Amherst that his, subordinate is killing men, women, and non